Hello. On the eve of the start of Operation Typhoon, conceived to capture Moscow, the commander of the division of the 43rd Wehrmacht Corps, which was part of Army Group Center, Infantry General Gotthard Heinrichsei, known in his circles as our poisonous gnome, had no doubts whatsoever about the imminent defeat of the Red Army's Western Front and was in a state of extreme enthusiasm. I am absolutely sure that another major success awaits us, and this is not up for discussion. September 29, 1941. The order given by Hitler to begin the battle for Moscow was described by Heinrichsei as nothing less than excellent and timely. October 1, 1941. After the Soviet front line was easily broken through on October 2, 1941, the entire corps under the command of Heinrichsei advanced for 2 days without encountering practically any organized resistance. The poisonous gnome, who believed in the quick and unconditional victory of Germany, foresaw with anticipation the rapid defeat of the Soviet Union, the fall of the capital of Moscow and the industrial Donbass region, and was generally filled with optimistic expectations. The enemy is already practically defeated, and now he will inevitably lose the remnants of his combat-ready forces, which in theory should be defending Moscow. By the end of this month, he will have neither his capital nor a vital industrial region in the Donetsk basin, and his army will be terribly weakened and demoralized. October 8, 1941. At the same time, he noted an interesting fact. Almost all captured Soviet soldiers unanimously declared to the Germans that their country would fight to a victorious end, even in the event of a forced retreat to the Ural Mountains, thus demonstrating their unbending will to resist. On October 10, 1941, Heinrichsei recorded in his notes a sharp drop in temperature to -5 degrees Celsius, and mentioned in passing that his soldiers were still not provided with winter uniforms, which undoubtedly caused him a feeling of growing anxiety and concern for the combat capability of his subordinates. The command of the Army Group, apparently, made a fundamental decision that the timely delivery of ammunition and food supplies is a higher priority than providing soldiers with warm clothing, although this point is extremely important in the conditions of the approaching winter. Further, as a result of 4 days of fierce fighting, the Corps, led by the poisonous gnome, managed to prevent the breakout of a Soviet group that had been encircled near Bryansk, capturing a total of 15,000 prisoners and 102 artillery pieces, which was a significant tactical victory. On October 16, 1941, Heinrichsei, located in the Sekhiniki area, northeast of Kaluga, wrote that the incessant wet snow, which had been falling all day, had brought the movement of his units almost to a complete halt, which created serious problems for further advancement. The roads have turned into an impassable black, bottomless quagmire before our very eyes, making them completely unsuitable for the movement of vehicles. Today, while driving to Kozulsk, I saw with my own eyes a long line of sunken, stuck, and broken trucks that were hopelessly stuck in the mud. About the same, if not a larger number of horses that had died from exhaustion were lying in the mud right next to these disabled machines, which created a terrible impression. The poisonous gnome, again, bitterly lamented the lack of proper winter clothing and hot food for his soldiers, and with sympathy described the inhuman suffering they were forced to endure in the harsh weather conditions. Soldiers have to stand guard for hours in the piercing wind and wet snow without warm clothes, for example, without basic gloves, with constantly wet feet, in the forest where there is simply no shelter from the bad weather, but where, nevertheless, the Russian soldier hides, in terrible cold, when there are not only no hot drinks, but simply nothing to fill the stomach with. On October 19, 1941, the poisonous gnome reported from Kozulsk that due to the torrential rain that had been falling all day and the resulting impassability of the roads, his corps stopped receiving timely food supplies, which led to serious food problems. This acute problem was partially solved by the fact that some flour supplies were found in the city and a bakery was set up in a captured collective farm. But nevertheless, Even Heinrich's headquarters began to receive significantly less bread than required. His corps became part of the 2nd Panzer Army, under the command of Colonel General Heinz Wilhelm Guderian, who had the nicknames Fast Heinz or Heinz Hurricane. Please subscribe to our channel and give us a like so you can hear many more interesting stories about World War II and the opinions of all participants about various events. On October 23, 1941, the poisonous gnome wrote again from Kozulsk that with relatively light frosts of -3 to -5 degrees Celsius, alternating with wet snow and rain, the situation on the roads had deteriorated so much that trucks were forced to move at less than 1 kilometer per hour, which made further advancement impossible. Logistical problems and the impassable terrain crushed all of Hitler's and Guderian's ambitious plans for a rapid thrust towards Moscow and the conduct of a so-called blitzkrieg. Most of the vehicle convoys have simply become stuck in the impassable mud, in swampy areas, in deep ruts, while the ditches from exploding shells reach a depth of half a meter and are completely filled with water. The trucks, which were barely moving anyway, have now finally broken down, while it is almost impossible to get the necessary spare parts, gasoline, fresh bread, oats for the horses. Nothing reaches the front. Horse-drawn carts have also hopelessly become stuck in the mud. Artillery pieces cannot be delivered to the required positions, and all the personnel are more occupied with trying to push the stuck vehicles than actively participating in combat operations. The roads are littered with horses that have died from exhaustion and broken trucks. All that remains for us is to slowly crawl on foot, which is extremely demoralizing for the troops. After the encirclement of Soviet troops near Bryansk and until the transfer of his headquarters to Kozulsk, Heinrich had never mentioned any significant resistance from Soviet troops in the direction of Moscow, which apparently meant that for him, as a division commander, it either did not exist at all or was so insignificant that it simply did not deserve a separate mention. Instead, the poisonous gnome describes in great detail the unpredictable behavior of the enemy from the point of view of the German command. Just now, showing miracles of bravery, he fought as bravely as never before, demonstrating resilience and courage. And then, suddenly, he shamefully runs back into the forest and allows himself to be captured, which is completely illogical and incomprehensible. At the same time, reconnaissance units reported that there was complete confusion and chaos in the Soviet units retreating in front of the poisonous gnome's corps. There were no food supplies. The troops were completely disorganized, refused to obey the orders of the higher command, were morally defeated, and the command was simply no longer able to manage their subordinates. On the Russian side, there is complete chaos and confusion. The entire chain of command and the well-established supply system are not functioning properly. The soldiers have not eaten anything for 4 days. One order is immediately followed by another order canceling it, so the soldiers no longer see any point in fighting and lose all motivation. Today, a captain voluntarily crossed over to us on horseback and reported that indiscipline and general chaos had reached such a critical level that he decided to leave this rabble and surrender to us. Heinrich notes the increasing cases of mass surrenders of Soviet soldiers, which indicates serious problems with morale in the ranks of the Red Army. But at the same time, individual units of the Red Army continue to fight with ferocity and fiercely launch counterattacks, demonstrating resilience and resistance. For every 10,000 bad Red Army soldiers, there are thousands of good fighters, and they even now, in the current circumstances, are putting up stubborn and fierce resistance and going on counterattacks, showing miracles of bravery. This is exactly what one of our divisions experienced yesterday, which suffered significant and heavy losses. The poisonous gnome was seriously worried about the prospect of Stalin transferring reinforcements from the Far East, which could fundamentally change the situation on the front not in favor of the German troops. On October 24, 1941, still in Kozulsk, he is already openly talking about strong and fierce resistance from the Red Army. as well as heavy fighting, which is becoming bloodier every day. He is very concerned about the delay in the delivery of winter uniforms, which is negatively affecting the morale of his subordinates. The Germans managed to put a captured Soviet felt factory in the city into operation in order to produce felt boots and blankets from felt for the soldiers of the Corps, but no other warm clothing could be obtained in sufficient quantities. On October 25, 1941, the poisonous gnome flew to Yukhnov to meet with Field Marshal von Kluge. In order to familiarize himself with the general situation at the front, he learned that the Hitlerites had managed to create a huge numerical superiority in manpower in the direction of Moscow. 4 German divisions against 1 Soviet one, but that the complete collapse of logistics did not allow them to fully exploit this advantage. Our entire advance has come to a halt due to the rain and, as a result, the terrible condition of the roads. The highway leading to Moscow is hopelessly clogged with stuck vehicles, which prevents us from moving forward. The situation had not changed even 3 days later, as the cold autumn rains, which were constantly drizzling and sometimes even pouring, continued. On October 27, 1941, logistics were still catastrophic and could rightfully be called paralyzed. Our entire supply of food and ammunition is stuck in the impassable mud and off-road conditions. The trucks simply have no gasoline left. The soldiers have no fresh bread, and the horses have no oats. Often, soldiers don't even have a clue about where exactly their trucks that are carrying the much-needed cargo are stuck. A greasy mud porridge, 30 to 40 centimeters thick, is simply floating down the road. And when a car or truck drives, a whole wave of mud goes in front of them until the vehicle gets stuck in it. Only a small part of the supplies that we are entitled to according to the norms remains in our warehouses at the moment. Under such terrible conditions, more and more trucks break down, and their repair in the field is extremely difficult. We had to leave our good passenger cars, which are designed for comfortable travel 60 kilometers behind the lines, because they are simply unable to overcome such impassable terrain. On October 29, 1941, the poisonous gnome added in his notes that Guderian's tank units had also experienced similar problems with advancement during the offensive on Tula. In fact, only 6 lead tanks and a company of infantry behind them were moving on the existing road, while the entire rest of the 2nd Panzer Army was at a standstill because the fuel was almost completely exhausted. Everything else that was intended for the offensive is behind them on the road to Tula, partially destroyed and sunk in the mud, which makes further advance impossible. On October 30th, 1941, Heinrichsheim noted in his records the complete lack of fuel, fresh bread, and hot coffee in his troops, as well as a shortage of ammunition, while, fortunately, small supplies of meat, cabbage, potatoes, and grain, even oats for the horses, still remained. The poisonous gnome, located in Lichven, bitterly lamented the complete failure of the Blitzkrieg strategy due to serious logistical and transportation problems caused by temporary warming and the muddy roads. We are stuck with all our motorized equipment, since the most important condition for its successful use is simply absent: solid roads. Nature has once again defeated technology. What an irony of fate that we are stuck right at the gates of Moscow itself, without the possibility of continuing the offensive when you see with your own eyes people standing knee-deep in the mud next to a half-sunken truck, under the gusts of cold wind, spitting slanting rain, in the mud up to their ankles, while their overcoat to the waist is completely covered with clay, and they still, without losing hope, try to dig under the car, cut down trees, and drag heavy logs, which need to be placed under the wheels, push, pull, and all this, as a rule, in vain. People are forced to spend the night in cars at temperatures from 0 to 2 degrees Celsius. The next day, everything repeats itself. It took as many as 12 draft horses to pull my all-wheel drive off-road vehicle onto the so-called improved road. And today my driver stated, a trip on the existing roads is impossible. It would require at least 50 liters of gasoline, and the entire Corps currently has only 80 left. On November 1st, 1941, Heinrichsei, still located in Lichven, already openly speaks of an impending disaster due to the chronic non-delivery of the necessary supplies and fuel via the Sikiniki-Kozelskliffen railway line and, as a consequence, of the complete shutdown of motorized units, which makes further advancement impossible. He adds to this the complete lack of communication with reconnaissance units and anti-tank groups, as well as an acute shortage of tea and coffee among the soldiers, who are forced to eat only liquid soups. Luftwaffe aircraft occasionally drop bread to the infantry, but combat vehicles have to be used as trucks to transport the necessary cargo. 8 days of warm and wet weather force the poisonous gnome to pray for the onset of frost. Although naive, he will soon be praying for warmth, realizing that the coming cold brings even greater problems at the same time. Guderian is catastrophically short of German infantry near Tula, which is stubbornly and heroically defended by 2 Soviet divisions, which makes his planned breakthrough impossible. On November 5th, 1941, Heinrichsei writes from Lichven that on November 3rd, 1941, the long-awaited frost finally began, and the temperature dropped to -5 degrees Celsius below zero, due to which the roads finally began to freeze, and the trafficability of equipment improved somewhat. Partisan detachments, consisting of men and women, are active around the city, offering heroic resistance to the German invaders and not betraying their comrades even in the face of certain death and execution if captured. They all, as one, remain silent and go to their deaths, demonstrating an unbending spirit. November 6, 1941. I was forced to order Beetlespatcher not to remove the captured partisans any closer than 100 meters from my window, as it is not a very pleasant sight in the morning. November 7, 1941. On November 8, 1941, the poisonous gnome reports that due to daytime warming with fog and showers, as well as nighttime frosts, the roads are in terrible condition and either become completely impassable due to mud or become covered with a thin layer of ice, which makes it difficult for equipment to move. The roads either become so slippery that vehicles spin like tops, losing control, or turn into a deep swamp, which makes them completely unsuitable for passage. German soldiers are extremely poorly dressed and shod, constantly catching colds and suffering from lice and scabies, which significantly reduces their combat capability. But despite everything, they are still full of confidence in the final victory. For weeks there is no way to wash and get oneself in order. The clothing and footwear of the troops are worn to shreds and almost fall apart while walking. The Russian soldiers, in the meantime, are dressed much better than us, which causes a feeling of anger and envy, but they will still lose this war because we are stronger. Then, after a brief warming, real Russian frost set in. Heinrichsei's corps faced fierce resistance from well-equipped Soviet troops who were not going to surrender. Heavy losses began, and the long-awaited winter uniforms and camouflage suits still did not arrive in sufficient quantities, and the poisonous gnome began to literally howl with impotent rage. In just 4 days, we lost 1,000 men, of whom 790 were killed or severely wounded, and 180 suffered frostbite, which indicates heavy losses here for several days. Temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Celsius. A piercing, icy wind blew, which felt like 1,000 needles. Now it has become a little warmer, only -8 to -10 degrees. But it is constantly windy. To fight in such terrible conditions, to lie on the frozen ground for hours under the barrage of enemy fire, while having no way to dig in. This is already almost beyond human capabilities, and no one is able to endure it for long. November 15th, 1941, -10 degrees, -15 degrees, -19 degrees frost starting from November 8th sometimes. A piercing, icy north or northeasterly wind blows, and then it is simply impossible to be outdoors. The face feels like it is being pricked by thousands of needles and blows, even through a winter helmet and thick gloves. The eyes tear so much that you can hardly see anything. and this seriously hinders firing. And it is precisely in these inhuman conditions, at a temperature of minus 20 degrees and with such a piercing wind, that our guys were forced to lie on the completely frozen ground for hours for 2 long days, under mortar and machine gun fire from the enemy. Standing out on the white snow like targets, only half of them had winter helmets and gloves, and all the rest were only our thin German coats and old light trousers, which are completely unsuitable for such frost for 8 to 10 days. There has been no hot tea or aromatic coffee at the front, and often there is no fresh bread either, which extremely demoralizes the soldiers. We also have a critical shortage of ammunition, so that in some places we simply have nothing to shoot at the enemy with, and this makes it impossible to conduct effective combat operations. It is already practically a miracle that we have only 180 cases of frostbite because the losses are significantly higher. November 19, 1941. In his notes, Heinrich records not only the increased local resistance and counterattacks of the Soviet troops, which are constantly increasing, leading to a rapid increase in German losses, but also the arrival of fresh, well-trained divisions of the Red Army, transferred from the Far East, which indicates that the Soviet command has reserves. The Germans, in an attempt to at least warm up a little, warmed themselves in small villages in peasant huts. Bedbugs, lice, mice, and rats. They are guaranteed to be present in every single house without exception. The forests around the settlements captured by the poisonous gnomes soldiers are teeming with Soviet partisans silently heading to certain death if captured, and small groups of Red Army soldiers making their way through the Bryansk and Vyazma pockets, who are desperately trying to break through to their own. Food is mainly obtained by confiscation from the local population, and only occasionally do the long-awaited trains with food supplies arrive, or food is dropped from German aircraft, which do not always reach the right place. In the area where we are stationed and forced to fight, we will soon eat absolutely everything, and we will have nothing left to eat. On November 25, 1941, the poisonous gnome writes about heavy fighting at a temperature of minus 14 degrees Celsius, about constant counterattacks by Soviet troops, and the arrival of more and more reinforcements for them, which significantly complicates advancement. German soldiers, in an attempt to warm up at least a little, are forced to fight in Russian felt boots and warm hats with ear flaps made of sheepskin or fur, which they confiscate from the local population. On November 29, 1941, Heinrich reports that his corps is breaking through to Tula with heavy fighting, overcoming minefields and under constant artillery fire, while repelling fierce counterattacks by Soviet troops who have no intention of surrendering. Soldiers have to lie for hours on the bare, frozen ground, without any protection, under continuous enemy fire, which demoralizes them. The ground is frozen to a depth of 1 meter, without the slightest possibility of moving. The soldiers were forced to remain in one place for up to 10 hours at a time, which exhausted them extremely and led to their deaths. 3 people simply froze to death. Unable to withstand such terrible conditions, all the villages in the area are almost completely destroyed, and the remaining houses are just ruins. Unsuitable for habitation, supplies are not arriving at all, which seriously affects the morale of the soldiers. On December 1st, 1941, the poisonous gnome notes even more fierce counterattacks by Soviet units, heavy fighting, and describes the position of his troops as critical, since the German troops still advancing on Tula and Moscow are in a state of extreme physical and moral exhaustion, which greatly complicates further advancement. We are in a truly desperate situation. As the situation is only getting worse every day, the enemy, as if gone mad, is fiercely attacking our recently occupied positions. Our guys are extremely exhausted, and their morale is falling with each day. In addition, the air temperature has dropped to around minus 20 degrees Celsius. A piercing, icy north wind is blowing, which further exacerbates the situation. Our people are at the limit of their strength, and their capabilities are exhausted. The losses are very heavy, and the burden on the soldiers is simply inhuman, as they have to constantly fight in such terrible conditions. On December 4th, 1941, Heinrich in his notes tells that on December 2nd, 1941, the long-awaited Soviet counteroffensive began on his sector of the front with the active use of soldiers in camouflage suits and Katyusha rocket launchers, which caused heavy losses among German soldiers. The severe frosts and piercing, icy wind forced the Germans to crowd by the dozens into the remaining peasant huts and warm themselves standing in them, since there is simply no other shelter. It is simply impossible to wash, clean, and get oneself in order because we have no conditions for this. Everything is teeming with lice, which do not give us any rest, and we are constantly itching and scratching. Many soldiers have purulent wounds due to constant scratching, which is extremely unpleasant. Others have serious problems with the bladder and intestines due to constantly lying on the cold floor, and they cannot rest and recover properly, as the need forces them to wake up in the middle of the night time after time, which extremely exhausts them. Instead of the much-needed oil, the soldiers are sent jam from Germany for some reason, and there is still no warm winter clothing, which causes discontent. Even the units that had been withdrawn to the rear for a few days for much-needed rest, battered by heavy fighting and grueling frosts, are a truly pitiful sight, which cannot but arouse sympathy. Dejected, unkempt, unwashed, unshaven, and uncombed, the undershirts of the soldiers have long ceased to be white, but have become brown from ingrained dirt. No one can stand still calmly. Everyone is constantly scratching and scrubbing, because the lice give us no rest. At the same time, Guderian's tanks continue to attack and break through the front near Tula, despite everything. In a private conversation with him, Heinrich points out that one of his divisions is already simply unable to carry out offensive operations. The number of soldiers and junior officers in its companies has decreased to 1/3 or even 1/4 of the authorized strength. And there is also a shortage of 700 trucks for full support, and another one is already almost in the same state and will also become combat ineffective in the near future. In the area where we are stationed and forced to fight for the last 6 weeks, everything has already been eaten clean, and there is simply nothing to take. This simply cannot continue any longer, and we will not last much longer in such conditions. We urgently need at least fats and more or less acceptable winter clothing. And ideally, we need to establish a regular supply of food and everything else as soon as possible, because at the moment, we only receive a reduced ration for a couple of days, and in the following few days we don't receive anything at all, which is unacceptable. Guderian replies to the poisonous gnome that the situation in his corps is no different from the situation in the entire 2nd Panzer Army, since things are equally bad everywhere. But when he personally reported this to von Bock, the latter did not want to listen to anything at all and gave the order to complete the capture of Tula. Regardless of any difficulties, they finally decide to undertake a last limited offensive at midnight from December 4th, 1941 to December 5th, 1941, and by a strike from the west, in conjunction with Guderian's tanks that had broken through from the east to encircle the long-suffering Tula. They part after this meeting, and soon Heinrich learns with horror that at night the temperature will drop to approximately -30 degrees below zero, which could lead to serious consequences. The poisonous gnome, realizing the seriousness of the situation, decides to hide this extremely important information from the rest in order not to spread panic. On December 5th, 1941, Heinrich's corps begins a last, desperate attempt to break through the Soviet defensive positions. But the frost intensifies to a critical mark of -32 degrees Celsius, which leads to the complete failure of automatic weapons and artillery pieces, or to their extremely poor firing, which makes it impossible for them to conduct full-fledged combat operations. One artillery battery does not even fire 25% of its shots because the guns simply do not work due to the frost. In another battery, the shells fly only 500 to 600 meters because the powder in the charge does not ignite properly, which makes aim fire impossible. A large number of machine guns have also frozen and refused to fire, making them useless. There were only a few kilometers left between the infantry units of the poisonous gnome and the tanks of Fast Heinz, but it was simply impossible to overcome them due to the fierce resistance of the Soviet troops, who had no intention of surrendering. Heinrichs's soldiers are freezing, which is terrifying. Since 8 o'clock in the evening yesterday, the guys have eaten nothing but cold bread, and the hot coffee in their flasks has simply turned into ice, which made it impossible to use. Disturbing reports are constantly coming from everywhere about more and more cases of frostbite, as well as frequent weapon failures, which is extremely depressing and demoralizing. Heinrich, seeing the hopelessness of the situation, calls Guderian to find out the situation on his sector of the front. The poisonous gnome frankly reports to him that if his units continue the offensive, they will simply freeze to death without fires on the bare ground under the open sky. Heinz Hurricane, realizing the futility of further action, is forced to agree with him and finally gives the order to end the pointless attacks and retreat to their starting positions, which effectively means the failure of the offensive. The result of the last battles was horrifying. This day cost us 250 killed and seriously wounded soldiers, as well as 850 frostbitten ones, which indicates serious losses. An infantry regiment had to be reorganized into 3 reinforced companies, in each of which there were only 10 non-commissioned officers and 38 privates left. And this is in addition to 5 heavy machine gun crews, which clearly demonstrates the scale of losses. The Blitzkrieg and Germany's victory over the Soviet Union, which seemed so close, eventually came to a dead end, demonstrating the fallacy of the initial plans. Goodbye. We were glad to see you on our channel. Don't forget to write comments, like and subscribe to the channel.